Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. Even though we've declared that we have ended the forum, we did not want to pass up the opportunity to hear from Father William Willoughby III, the Reverend Doctor, all the things. William is a person that I had the pleasure of meeting at the North American Deans Conference 2 years ago. He, along with his wife Mary, because the Deans Conference, the Deans come along with their spouses. And I was drawn into conversation with them both because of our shared connection with Chicago, which William will tell us about, a little bit more about in a moment, but also because of their understanding of our situation here in Chicago at the cathedral as we were facing the challenge about what to do with this building. Actually, it's Mary who looked at me and she said, "You don't sell downtown property in the middle of a city. You don't sell it because they don't make it anymore." And there was just something about the clarity with which Mary stated that to me that really kind of helped me feel encouraged as we continued our conversations with our bishop and trustees and all that to try and find the way forward with this. And so in the midst of that, just there's much that William has to share with us about his ministry, and there's not exactly a topic except for the messenger is the message, and I've asked if William could just come here and reflect with us and for us on whatever you feel called to reflect on, but drawing on those common connections. He'll tell you more about his history here in Chicago and his ministry as the cathedral and the canon and dean of not only the cathedral but the diocese, right? Mm-hmm. Which is an interesting distinction. So at any rate, at that point, I'm going to stop talking and allow William to take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is there any particular thing you would like me to focus on? Let me give you a thumbnail sketch, or kind of a timeline anyway. I came to Chicago at the age of 17 to go to U of C. I started a program in physics because everybody in my family has been a scientist since forever. My father was a nuclear engineer and physicist. My grandfather was a civil engineer. My great-grandfather was a civil engineer. My great-great-grandfather was a civil engineer, and my great-great-great-grandfather was a medical doctor and a Cumberland Presbyterian preacher. And so the Willoughbys have been in North Alabama since around 1815, when it was still part of West Georgia. I actually was born in Alabama, where my dad was stationed at Fort McClellan in Anniston, Alabama. And then he went on to do graduate work at Berkeley in California. And when I was in the first grade, we moved to South Carolina, which is where I then went on from there. And my godmother in Greensboro, Alabama, was a graduate of the U of C in 1920. And she and I had a special kind of relationship. One of the things she challenged me to do was go to the library and look things up and see if I could stump her on a subject. And in all the years growing up, I never did stump her. And I got pretty deep on some things, and I still couldn't stump her. So I decided when it came time for me to go to university that this is where I wanted to come. And Miss Louise Withers was a woman of probably about 4'9", and a force of nature, just a force of nature. She started the junior year abroad program from Hollins, what now is Hollins University in Virginia, a women's university, and in Paris. And then her sister-in-law became very, very ill and died from cancer. She came back to Greensboro, Alabama to raise her nieces and nephews and stayed. She made the choice at that point to teach French at Baptist Hill High School, which was, in the days of segregation, the African American school, and which upset a lot of her friends that she would do such a thing like that. And Fortunately, she was a member of the Episcopal Church, and the majority of them just said, "Well done, good and faithful servant," and supported her, starting with my grandmother, and who herself, as she said, was an import. Pretty early on, I learned what the difference between a Yankee is and a damn Yankee, which is that a damn Yankee is somebody who moves south and never goes back. And my grandmother was one of them. And she came from Honeydale Falls, New York, and had gone to school at Emerson College outside of Boston. So, and she has been a victim of the Great Flu of the First World War, and her doctors told her to move south for her health. Met my grandfather while he was working on the building the Lions Bridge in St. Augustine, Florida. So, so deep roots in the South, a lot of connections there, and so on and so forth. But by far, I will say, it's the Episcopal Church that has really connected me to a whole breadth of relations, starting with St. James, really, in a real way. Even though I was near to St. Paul and the Redeemer, they went through a number of changes during that period of time, and Father White left, and there was a bit of turmoil, so I kind of moved up here. I just decided I could take the red line and come up this way. And then I met some people here, both clerical and lay, that just were engaging, introduced me to ways of thinking that rural South Carolinian had not been exactly introduced to, and the like. I would say that I've been afforded all sorts of opportunities over time. For example, when I decided to go to seminary, I was sponsored by this diocese, and this parish sponsored me, and I worked it out with Bishop Montgomery at the time, and with Nashotah House, where I went to seminary, to do my middle year abroad at St. Stephen's House, Oxford. And what happened in that, and my thinking was, okay, I'm part of the Anglican communion. I need to be part of something that's not so American. And so I went there, and I was the only American in the college. I hardly met any Americans until one day I was sitting waiting on some things to happen, and a punk rocker comes through the lobby of the building that I'm waiting in, and he has, safety pin ear clips, and he has 3 different colors in his hair. And this was a new phenomenon to me because America hadn't quite embraced rockers yet. And I looked across the way and I saw this woman laughing, and I went and I said, "I've never seen such a thing." She's like, "No." And then I could tell from her accent immediately she was an American. She's the first American I had spoken to in a month. This woman ends up becoming my wife. So, a lot of my friends said, "You go all the way to England and you marry an American?" But anyway.
That's a lot more convenient.
That's true. That's true. Especially since I had 1 more year of seminary, she had 1 more year of college. But out of that, those kinds of relationships, and the relationships I made when I was at St. Stephen's House, which was here in Chicago, dimly some of you might remember them. It was an ecumenical house that encouraged conversations between Orthodox and Roman Catholics and Episcopalians and Lutherans and even Methodists. We were kind of ahead of the curve in terms of that at the time, and the like. So that's how I got to meet Archbishop Tutu. That's how I got to meet Richard Holloway, who became the primus of the Scots Episcopal Church. That's how I got to meet and serve Ken Leach, who I think is probably one of the most important 20th century theologians that our church has produced. And I mean, I could go on through that.
I realize, William, that when I introduced you, I'm not sure I said that you've been, how long have you been the dean?
36 years
36 years.
Of where?
in Georgia,
Oh, okay.
in Savannah, Georgia.
And so that's quite a long time for you to be able to reflect on the value of cathedral, the value of
Thank you
this,
for
and so
redirecting.
I would love it if, because we're sort of at a moment at St. James where we're reaffirming, and we're right now focused on the issue of the building and saving this
Sure.
building and being able to be this major
Right.
place in the middle of the city.
I
that
can
nobody
obviously
stops.
talk to some of the things that were ahead of us when I went to Savannah in 1987. And one is buildings are always deteriorating.
Mhm.
And so we made a strategic decision, which is that there's no such thing as delayed maintenance. That maintenance has to be hit hard, quick, and often. That's an important thing. Otherwise, it just kind of builds up. The other was, how can we best engage our neighborhood? How can we best engage? So we took a year of prayer and thought and engagement with our neighborhood, and for us, it came down to we needed to start housing corporation for low to moderate income housing. That was the greatest need in our neighborhood. So that's what we started. We ended up doing about 150 units of housing in the neighborhood before we got priced out. Ultimately, the developers, as the developers will, hopped on the bandwagon and made it impossible for us to continue. But we got it started and moving. Were there downtime? Yeah, we probably opened the corridor for gentrification in some ways. But we did actually secure a certain amount of housing for low to moderate income, and that has stayed the same. So, and we have there were 100 units of senior housing that still is operating that we started. That sort of thing. So, the question you have to ask yourself is what are some of the things that God is, already doing in front of you, but you don't see. That was one of the things that we had to do was, how do we open our eyes, and how can we see better, and some of it came from just listening, and I mean showing up at various neighborhood events, neighborhood gatherings, neighborhood concerns, and the like. Our school system was going through a massive transition. We were under court orders because of desegregation still in 1987. And so we had to figure out how to do that better. Well, I had just come from being an assistant head of school at St. Hilda's and St. Hugh's in Manhattan. So I engaged the educators in the parish and said, how can we address some of those issues? And they were thrilled to have a forum to kind of hash some things out and let's see what we can do. And maybe we won't get the superintendent on our side, but we'll at least get a body of educators in the area on our side in terms of it. The story of how I got to work on a doctorate in education has a lot to do with the forcefulness of Mother Ruth, the founder of the school and of the order. And she just enrolled me in classes in night school, and when I first started with them. One could say Mother Ruth was a clarion call to the direction I needed to move in terms of some things. So I'm a great believer in listening. We're going through a period right now, I would say, in Savannah, where the question becomes, how can we allow the story, the important story, the determinative story of African Americans in Savannah speak clearly. That's very hard. That's very hard because there's all sorts of layers of junk that have been built up. The greatest of which is the mythology around the lost cause. Fortunately, I didn't really grow up in a very strong sense of the lost cause. I didn't even really learn about the lost cause till I came to Chicago.
Right, and there may be some people who don't know what that is, so it would be good for you to just say.
Okay, the lost cause, shortly put, is that that somehow or another the South had the right philosophical and moral position with regards to slavery, and which exactly it's near impossible, but you still see it. You still see it, and that we need to. All sorts of statues were erected by the Daughters of the Confederacy, mostly. They changed the textbooks in the schools, so they talked about, you know, how in losing we really won, because, you know, and in some ways what Jim Crow is about is a real reversal of the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments, and you know, a deal was made. The deal was made where basically the Union troops would be brought out of the South, and the leadership, the white leadership, would be allowed to gain ascendancy again, and they did exactly. And what they did was to effectively disenfranchise black men, because at that time there were no women. What's interesting is that it was interesting at that time is that the proponents of the franchise from the black side really wanted women, and that was almost, you know, even the black men were like, no, in some ways, and that says something about the patriarchy of the day. All I have to do is listen to the stories of my great-grandfather, Judas Edgar Willoughby, and realize how strong that was, except with regards to his wife. And because Mary Alice Byers Willoughby would, if she wanted to go and do something, she just took his personal train car, he was the head engineer of the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, and go. And it was her own Learjet of her day. And if Mr. Willoughby was not ready to go, she went. So in some real ways, there was kind of this certain dynamic that went on there, but ultimately it was very patriarchal, as well as racially. I served, besides St. Paul's, I also served a small African American congregation in St. Bartholomew's, which is the oldest in Georgia. And at one time it had as many as 15,000 members. At that point, there were probably more black Episcopalians than there were white Episcopalians. But it served the plantations up and down the Ogeechee River. It was one of 5 stational churches in that mission. So the question is how to kind of recapture that history which has been swept aside, and how to get the Gullah Geechee culture, which is so incredibly influential. I probably don't think there's an American that hasn't at least experienced some of it through the cooking of Gullah Geechee culture. You know, if you've had turnip greens and collard greens or grace, or I'm trying. I don't know. Just there's a whole.
There's rice, there's a dirty rice.
Yeah, there's a dirty rice. Red rice. Any of those kinds of things you're going to find rooted in that culture. Yes, sir.
Our book club here at St. James just read The Demon of Unrest by Eric Larson, which is a build up to the Civil War.
Yes.
Basically a lot about your hometown of Charles.
Well, Charleston is 100 miles away from me, but
Yeah.
Charleston was the lead city in terms of a lot of that.
Exactly, but if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it.
Right.
It's exactly the things you're talking about.
There's a wonderful book,
What's the name of the book again, please?
The Demon of Unrest.
The Demon of Unrest. There's a wonderful book out there that's on the other side of the narrative, which is called Slaves in the Family, and it was written by Edward Ball. The Ball family was one of the largest slaveholding families in Charleston, and Theodore Porter Ball was a scion of that family and was one-time rector of St. Paul's in the 50s. His son Edward, who was born in Savannah while he was rector there, went on to be cannonball in Puerto Rico. But before Edward wrote a book about the family and how various lines. So various lines of interwoven. I mean, the Ball family ended up being way ahead of the Jefferson family in terms of acknowledgement. Although the fact that he did it upset probably half of his aunts and uncles. Very much.
Could you repeat, you said, and it went by, that at that time there were probably more Black Episcopalians than any other kind. Which time frame was that?
We're talking about prior to the Civil War.
Prior to Civil War.
Yeah.
Wow. That is news to me.
The first baptism at Christ Church, which is the oldest, 1734. First baptism to take place at Christ Church was African American. And there wasn't kind of segregation to the balconies at that point. You know that part of the reason why Absalom Jones walked out of church in Philadelphia was because they tried to impose, in the Methodist church that he was serving at the time, they tried to impose segregation to the gallery. And he and the founder, Richard Allen, who founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and then Absalom Jones, who founded African Church of St. Thomas, and got an agreement with the Episcopal Bishop in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to be ordained first deacon and then priest, and becomes the first African American priest of the Episcopal Church. It was over segregation. The other thing is that there are all sorts of small things that one can do that people notice. For example, one of the things I used to say to people at St. Paul's was, "I'm your gift. You raise the money that allows me to have a full-time position to go and be present on all these things." And so I purposely was present at neighborhood association meetings, at Board of Education meetings, at NAACP meetings, at various other sorts of things, so that I would be known around town. I've been there so long now that I don't care what I dress like. I can be in my running clothes, which I don't run much anymore, I walk mostly. But they know, all of a sudden I'll hear across the park, "Father Willoughby!" I'm like, oh, what did I do? I hope I was behaving myself. And the like. But so there was that small sort of thing. The other was we kept the doors open. And figured out I figured out how to lock down the system so that you couldn't get from the church into where people were working. unless you went to certain places, ports of entry, so to speak. But it meant that people could go aside, they could say a prayer, they could light a candle, they could spend time in meditation, they could do whatever would bring balm to the soul.
And we have very high traffic here at the cathedral. I don't know if folks have had a chance to be here in the off hours, but most weekdays, if you were to just sit and watch the back door, people walk by, they sort of like the cartoon, you know, they kind of back up, they come back up the stairs, they come in, they're in awe, they often sit at the back and light a candle, just sit and take time. And so this idea of being curators and stewards of holy space in the midst of what goes on in a busy urban area, and it's all kinds of folks. And you mentioned it in the 9 o'clock service. There will be. I'm aware of the fact that we're about to raise a heck of a lot of money to do what we need to do to keep that, to restore the historical building, and to obtain this property so that it can be for us what it is for the support of our ministries, our outreach ministries, and our music school and all this stuff. It's going to mean we're raising, in a way, an obscene amount of money. And there will be people who will say, well, what if you took that money and you gave it, to causes or to the poor? And you sort of touched on that a little bit, Father William. I'd like you to come pick that up again.
Okay. We've got to have the confidence of who we are as the body of Christ in these moments, and recognize that we do something nobody else does, which is we actually make available what the Celtic Church used to refer to as thin places. And St. James is a thin place. And a thin place actually needs, that's where it's so easy to be in the presence of angels and archangels and the whole company of heaven. You know? And whether it's through the music, whether it's through the worship, whether it's through the outreach ministries, whether it's through just people engaging someone who's come, like I did at the age of 17, and that's just spiritually open and ready to look and ready to receive. You know, those are all important things. And let's face it, we're in a world that, well, it's never really changed. I said I started in physics. I moved to British history and medieval studies, and you know, in the Middle Ages, there were always people out there that were greedy and power hungry, and it usually was at the end of a sword or a lance or something. You know, nowadays it's the end of a Beretta or a stem gun or whatever. But the greediest have always been those who have the most power in the situation. And it's no different. It's no different.
Dean Lee, something's going on in our neighborhood, and I'm curious if the cathedral, and if you've had a chance to talk to Dean Willoughby about it, is the gathering of young people down on the river. It's not very far from here, right?
Right, in Streeterville, there's been little hordes of young people who are going, and really not good. There have been 2 incidents I'm aware of, and you're right. But it's alarming because it's a bunch of kids who are just a few blocks over that way.
What could we do as Christians?
Right, and what could we do? Right. It's because, of course, the response of the world is let's get the police up and running and let's get, police stations and all that. I think, one of the things we are doing with our Summer in the City is that, and we've done for 20 years, is we invite children from around the city to come and be here with us in a safe space. It's only 2 weeks, but they come, it's a safe space. They are exposed to kids from around the city, not just their neighborhood. They are welcomed into this space by the St. James community. They are taken around to the downtown. It used to be the case that a lot of the kids who came, and these are children from sort of 8 to 13, that age, who had never been downtown, lived their whole life in Chicago, but had never been downtown because when you're a mom putting together your budget for the week, you know, $20 for the round trip downtown for you and your 4 kids is not necessarily something that I'm gonna do, right? So a lot of children who live in this great city and had never seen all of these cultural treasures to be taken sort of as VIP guests and have these experiences so that they have a different perception of what's possible for them. Their imagination is opened up, and they have the experience of being welcomed as treasured guests in this place. So I think that's transformative work. But it is a good question. Is there something more we could be doing?
Because like, I want to go down and see it, but my husband doesn't want me to,
Okay.
because I think he's afraid I'm going to get beaten up.
Right.
But maybe a group of church people could
Could
go
and
together
walk
or
through.
something.
I have to tell you, I was walking with my little, walking
Yeah.
stick, along with Frank Donahue, who's not exactly the brawniest man, our ancient retired priest, as I call him. And we were walking, and there was a group of kids, and he was clearly nervous because he's vulnerable, and he had kind of been a little bit brushed by the group of kids the week before. And this was just last week, and he said, oh dear, he kept saying he was worried for me and my husband who's this tall. I said, I think we're gonna be fine. But we're kind of walking towards, and of course this group of mostly teenagers, I walk up and I see someone my age, roughly, a chaperone figure who's with them, who just basically says to them, move out of her way, she has a crutch. So, I think part of the problem is there's been like 2 incidents I know of, but so then every group of young people gets looked at with fear and when in fact they're well supervised and with their grown-ups with them and all that. So just as normal. So I think it's hard, but that's a really interesting instinct you have to kind of move into it rather than run away.
Run away.
Yeah.
And I would say that's actually, if you can encourage each other to move more into things. My mentor here was a man named Richard Young. He founded Bishop Anderson House, and he started St. Stephen's House on the south side. And one of the things that I saw him do time and again was just kind of walk into the middle of things. Now this was a guy who had been in the Merchant Marine during the Second World War and had commanded Liberty ships, never lost a ship during the Second World War, which is quite amazing. But he just was fearless when it came down to it. And if you can find somebody who's kind of like that, use them. Use them to your advantage.
I have a different question. We have time.
Yeah.
At the top, at Lisa's introduction, I think she mentioned the distinction between that you're dean of the diocese rather than the dean of the cathedral. What is the difference there? I guess I'm just curious if.
Well, it's more along the Canadian model, which is that you're dean of the diocese and rector of the cathedral. And you have all but 3 cathedrals in the American church are essentially pro-cathedrals. They act as cathedral for the diocese. A cathedral in the English sense of the word is you have a foundation which allows you to operate independent of the diocese. So Canterbury Cathedral has its own foundation, which then is governed by the chapter. The chapter is usually made up of the dean and 3 priests. And they're the governing body of the work. So
I guess I was wondering functionally, is there a difference there where there have been situations where I think from what I understand what's happening here in Chicago with the diocese, that there's maybe a slightly difference in the vision between the diocese versus the cathedral for the future in the city, and if you had any kind of experiences working through that in your role in Georgia and how you.
Well, there's always there's always going to be a certain amount of differences, and they have to be negotiated out. I think the provost has done an extraordinary job at getting that conversation going, and I think it's got a future to it that will be beneficial both for the diocese and the cathedral in the long run. But it does mean kind of letting go of certain things on both sides. and finding mutual ground recognizing you're not going to agree on all things. That's just, and sometimes you're going to go out and do some things and you're going to fail. And there's nothing wrong with failure. In fact, in the business world, failure is considered an important piece of success. Somehow or another in the church world, we've decided you can't have failure. I guess it's because if you do, then you're failing God. But you're not really. God's never failed. Whatever we do, God's not failed.